Yeah, to our moms, to our mothers, mother figures in our lives, our spiritual mentors. We're so thankful for who you are. So thankful for all the care and the energy and the guidance that you have put into our lives. We're so thankful that you are who you are. So happy Mother's Day to all of you. As we go into this sermon today, I just want to recognize, we're in week 7 of this series already. It seems to have gone fast for me, but what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about how the book of Esther was built before we get into the passage we're going to talk about today. And it matters that we recognize the structure of this book because it has kind of a point to it. So it might sound a little academic on the front end of this, but please don't let me lose you because this is going somewhere, okay? So the book of Esther, it's written in a style that we see in the Bible very often, a style that's called a chiastic structure. If you look at the story of Noah, it's written in this style. The Tower of Babel is written in this style. The book of Daniel is written in this style. And it's not just Old Testament. If you look in the New Testament, John 4, when Jesus has an interaction with the woman at the well, it's written in this style. If you look at Paul and Timothy's letter to Philemon, it's written in this style. So what is a chiastic structure? Well, it's a way of storytelling that's maybe a little different than the way that we're used to storytelling. We're used to a very linear idea of how storytelling goes, but a chiastic structure is a way of storytelling that's symmetrical. In other words, there are details and there are phrases on the front end of the story that are often repeated in some way on the back end of the story, with one big difference, that it's not just symmetrical, it's often mirrored. In other words, something makes a change in the middle that gives a different meaning or a different interpretation to that detail or that phrase. So let me give you just kind of a really boiled down, smaller idea of what this looks like. It's a really common statement that we all know. It's part of our country's history. But in January of 1961, JFK became president, and in his inaugural speech, he gave one of the most famous lines in all of our country's history. He said this: "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." So you can see it's kind of the same thing. It's just changed a little bit, but it has a drastically different meaning on the backside. That's kind of a boiled down version of what this chiastic structure is. So let me show you kind of how it plays out in Esther. If you'll track with me for a moment, where we've already been in the book, if you think about chapters 1 and 2, we talked a lot about the king. We talked about the greatness of the king, about his wealth, and we would see him having these great parties. So the greatness of the king of Persia is chapters 1 and 2. Now, if we fast forward all the way to the end of the book, and I'm going to give you some spoilers here, we're going to see the greatness of Mordecai. We're going to see it framed a little different, but the greatness of Mordecai is how the book will wrap up. Now, if you go all the way back towards the beginning again, you'll remember that there was this moment where this man named Haman was elevated in status. He was elevated in status in front of the people, and he was elevated in status in the presence of the king. So we see Haman begin to rise in prominence. Now, if we go towards the end of the book, we settle into chapter 8, we'll see that Mordecai is the one who's beginning to be elevated in status in front of the people and in the presence of the king. If we go back over to chapter 3, you'll remember Haman. He's the villain of the story. Haman makes this decree because his hatred for Mordecai, he wants to kill all of the Jewish people throughout all of Persia. So he makes a decree to get rid of them. Later in the book, what we're going to see is Mordecai, now that he has status, he's going to make a decree to allow the Jews to rise up and to fight back. So you see these two different decrees. Now, over in chapter 4, if you'll remember, Mordecai and Esther, they start to make a plan of how they can rescue their people out of what's happening. And then over in chapter 8, we see the details of that plan. So you see kind of the mirror of it. And then what Dave talked about a little bit last week is we see these banquets that Esther begins to throw. Chapter 5, she throws a banquet. Chapter 7, she throws a banquet. So why does this matter? Well, because in the middle of every one of these chiastic stories, there's always a moment that changes everything. There's a pivotal phrase, there's a pivotal moment in the people's lives that begin to change the way that the story is moving. And that's what we get to see today in the book of Esther. And it's a really significant moment. I don't know if we would call it a significant moment, if the way that we were looking at it. But this is how it starts off in chapter 6, verse 1. This is the central passage, the central idea of the book of Esther. It says this: on that night the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Now, I think that if we're even a little bit familiar with Esther, we always think it's that moment where Mordecai says, for such a time as this, you've been brought into the kingdom. We think that's the pivotal moment because that inspires Esther, and she steps up, she says, I'm going to do it. And if I perish, I perish. That feels like the climax of the story for us. But scholars, commentators, everybody will say what I just read to you is the pivotal moment in the entire book of Esther. And it doesn't feel like it, if I'm honest with you. Because even as I read that, I bet a lot of you were like, yeah, I've been there. You lay down, you can't sleep. And so he does essentially the ancient version of turning on Netflix. He's like, hey, bring a book and read it to me. I can't sleep. I need something boring to listen, so read the Chronicles to me. And so these guys bring in and they start to read through these books. He's hoping he'll fall asleep. But he doesn't. Actually, what he hears, it wakes him up even more. Listen what it says in verse 2. It says, and it was found written how Mordecai told about and it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So if you'll remember, back in chapter 2, there was a plot to kill the king. Mordecai heard it. He stepped up. He shared about it. He saved the king's life. And now the king is disturbed because he's finding this out. And he's saying, what has been done for this man? And he's going to find out that nothing has been done. Mordecai's just been living in limbo. He did this great thing for him, but there's nothing that gives him any prominence. It bothers the king. And so he pulls in his closest advisor. He pulls in Haman. He wants to remedy this problem. And now track with me. So far, where we're landing here, Mordecai, as this story of Esther has unfolded, Mordecai really, his life has just gotten more and more and more uncertain. Because there's this death warrant that has been signed for his people by Haman. And it's coming for them. The day is drawing closer and closer and closer. And so everything around him is beginning to shake. Everything is uncertain. And so Haman is just blinded by this rage for Mordecai. He's coming after him. And he signed this death warrant for all these people. And now track with me. You can kind of see how this would be an uncertain thing for Mordecai to deal with. A lot of shaky ground. And the king pulls in Haman. He pulls in Haman and he says, I want to remedy this problem. But the reason why Haman is there that day is not because he wants to aid the king in anything. He's there to tell the king about this instrument of death that he has created for Mordecai. He's created a gallows. He's created an instrument to not only kill him, but embarrass him in front of everybody. He wants to make a spectacle out of this man. And so that's why Haman is there today. But then everything begins to take a different turn when the king couldn't sleep. And here's what the king asks of Haman. It says, the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? That phrase is repeated in this chapter over and over, to the man who the king delights to honor. And Haman said to himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? Remember that pride that Dave talked about last week? It's still here. Like he is thinking, well, okay, the king is talking about this man who he desires to honor. And he's like, well, who better to honor than me, right? I mean, I'm Haman. I run the whole place. And so he gets this big bubble of pride in his life and he starts to think, what would I want? Like, what do I really want? And he starts to list off these things. Well, I would want a robe that the king has worn. And I would want a horse that the king has ridden on. And part of this is, it's kind of playing out of this historical idea in Persia. There was a superstition in Persia that anything that the king or anything that a royal person would touch, that a little bit of their glory and a little bit of their power would rub off on that thing. And if you touched it, you got that too. And so Haman is thinking, yes, I want more glory. I want more power in my life. So what you should do for this man, who's secretly me, you should give him a robe and you should give him a horse and let me experience all of this. He's thinking, it's me. That's who you're going to honor. So give me this stuff. But instead of getting that glory, this is what happens. The king says to Haman, king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. So not only is now Mordecai his mortal enemy, he's going to get all the glory. He's going to get all the power, but Haman's the one who has to give it to him. He's the one who has to get the robe and put it on his shoulders. He's the one who has to get the horse and let him get up on top of the horse. He's the one who has to walk the horse through town, and he has to verbally speak out how great this guy is. How embarrassing must that be for him? What a crash for his pride to come down, because he thought this was all coming in my direction. This is all about me. And this is where, if you're reading this book for the very first time, you would start to see God's providence. That's the theme throughout Esther, the providence of God. The providence is this idea that God's hand is guiding everything in our lives, that he's involved in every detail, that he's working in different people's hearts, he's working in different circumstances, that he is orchestrating a story that's so much larger than what we can see. This is the moment that if you were reading this for the first time, you would begin to see the gears of God's providence begin to turn. You would start to see that symmetrical side of the story. You'd start to see the mirrored side of the story where now God's people are going to come out on top just because the king couldn't sleep. It seems like such an ordinary moment, but God uses that ordinary moment to do an extraordinary thing. He completely turns the tide of this story. But I'll be honest with you, like that's where the struggle is for me. Because it's easy for me to stand here in 2024 and look across the whole landscape of this story that happened thousands of years ago and go, oh yeah, there's where God was, there's where God was, there's where God was. I can see the entire story. It's easy for me to do that right here. But when you are in the moment, it is so hard to see what's going on. It's so hard when you're experiencing the struggle, the right now, when you haven't gotten to that pivotal moment that turns everything. It's so hard to stand in those moments and think, yeah, God's providence, he's got this. He's got what's going on. He's orchestrating something good for me when all that we're experiencing is something painful. When we're dealing with something that's very uncertain, when our relationships are uncertain, when our careers are uncertain, when our marriages might be uncertain. Moms, for you ever have uncertain moments with your kids? I mean, I'm not a mom, but Allison and I, we've raised 4 kids. There's been a lot of uncertainty over the years. Like the uncertainty of like, when are we finally getting them all out of diapers, right? Then you get into like the toddler age, the uncertainty of like, is this attitude going to be here forever? And then that goes into the teenage years, and the answer is yes. It's always going to be there. But there's a lot of uncertainty as we raise our kids. They get into schools. They start to interact with their friends. There's a lot of uncertainty. That's the struggle, is that I can see the whole story of Esther. I can't see my whole story right now. And so when I'm in the moment, when you're in the moment, isn't that the struggle? That yes, God's providence is a beautiful thing to talk about, but in the moment, it's really difficult sometimes. It's difficult to carry those things through life. And I think one of the biggest things that we can glean, that we can get out of Esther, is that when life seems uncertain, that we can trust in his providence. That we really can trust in his providence. But I think that there's an active way that we do that. And I think that it all has to do with God's promises. That's what I want us to focus in on today, is the promises that God gives to us. Those are the things that are meant to sustain us through these moments, through the uncertainty, to rely on God's promises to get us through to the next chapter, to the next phase, to the next whatever it may be, to trust in how he's leading us. And the reason why I think this is so important is because, you know, in the scriptures, there are over 7,400 promises. In one study I read, they counted out 7,453 promises in the scriptures. That's a lot. That's a lot. That's a lot of promises. That means that the Bible is just saturated with promises for you and for me. And some of those promises, they're positive promises where they're blessing and they're assurance. Some of them are negative promises, right? They're promising that there will be justice, there will be consequences for our actions. We don't get completely scot-free there. There are some promises that lay in that direction. But one thing that we can really see in the scriptures and then throughout church history is that the followers of God, the people of God, have always built their lives on these promises. And that's the thing that has really sustained them and gotten them through life. That's the thing that when everything around them becomes very uncertain, that they anchor themselves into, is the promises of God. The Apostle Peter, he was writing to the early church, a church that was really having a lot of persecution. For them, life was very uncertain. They were trying to follow Jesus in the best way they could, but they were getting a lot of heat from those around them. And I want you to hear what Peter has to say to them. He says, his divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness. All things. Through the knowledge of him who called us to his own glory and excellence, by which he has granted to us his precious and very great promises, so that through them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from the corruption that is in the world because of sinful desire. I know Peter's saying a lot here, but essentially what he is saying is you have everything you need. If you'll notice that on the front end, you have everything you need for life and for godliness and to partake of the divine nature. In other words, you have everything you need to be a part of that bigger story that God is telling across the universe. And he says we do that through his promises. And he gives all these adjectives because you can tell Peter loves them. He says they're precious and they're very great promises. And that's how we have access to this larger story, by relying and building our lives on the promises of God. But the problem is when we get stuck in the moment, we miss something vital about these promises. We miss something really vital about these promises because here's what I know. Having everything you need doesn't necessarily mean you're using everything you have. That's a chiastic statement. I just snuck it in on you. See that? Having everything you need doesn't necessarily mean you're using everything you have. In other words, we can have everything we need, but still be missing out on something. So let me kind of give you a bit of an illustration of this. When I was a kid, I loved to build tree houses, and I was terrible at it, but I had tools around, and I had some scrap wood, and so we had a lot of woods around our house. I would build tree houses all over the place, but they were probably dangerous. You're lucky I'm here. I'm lucky I didn't die. But I always dreamed of having like this most elaborate tree house, right? If you think, this is kind of an old reference, but you think Swiss Family Robinson, remember their tree house? If you ever saw that movie, a really old movie, but they had like drawbridges, they had running water, they had tiger pits. And I didn't know, up in West Virginia, how many tigers there are there, but I thought, I want to be ready, right? So tiger pits. So I always dreamed of this elaborate tree house. Fast forward many years later, my three older kids, they're playing outdoors a lot, and I thought, I want to build them a really nice tree house like I wanted when I was a kid. And so I finally got the chance to build my big dream house, their tree house. I built their tree house. Although I built it big enough I could fit in it. And it was 2 stories. It had a rope bridge. It had all the fun stuff that we wanted to have. But here's kind of how it rolled out is that, we started to dream. We got some books on tree houses, and we got online and we started to look at things. And we sat down at the dining room table and we started to sketch it out and design what we wanted to do. And I made a list of all the things I needed. I needed some lumber. I needed some bolts. I needed some screws. Went to the lumber store, got all that stuff. And I brought it home and I took it out of the back of my truck and I put it in the driveway to prepare to build the treehouse. Now, in that moment, I had everything I needed for a treehouse, but I didn't have a treehouse. You see where I'm going? Peter says you have everything you need for life, for godliness, to be a partaker of the divine story that's happening around you, but there's some assembly required. There's some things that we need to do with these promises. They don't just automatically become alive in our lives. There's something that we have to do with them. And that's kind of where I want to spend a little bit of our time. I think that these promises of God, if we handle them well, they build certain things into our lives. I think that they build certain things into our lives. I think the first one is the promises of God, they build hope. They build hope inside of us. And when we're going through difficult moments, hope is something we need. I don't know if you guys watch the news, read the news, but there's a lot of despair. Pick whatever country you want, whatever topic you want, whatever side you want. There's a lot of things going on right now. And the news, whatever form you get it in, will often kind of spin it in a way that's not great. It can cause a lot of anxiety. It can cause a lot of despair inside of us. And that news is often just delivered straight to us. Like, think about the era that we live in right now. More than any other era of human history, we have the collective news and knowledge of the world coming into our homes 24/7. Maybe on a TV, maybe on a computer, sometimes right in our pocket. That's crazy to think of, that you can read news that just happened around the other side of the world. No wonder we're so anxious, because we get inundated with all of this news and all of this despair that's happening around the world, and it will tear us down. And so we need the promises of God to build us up, to build hope inside of us. I want you to hear what Hebrews says in the New Testament. It says this: let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering. In other words, it's going to provide an anchor for you in these difficult times. For he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. So holding on to these promises of God, it produces hope inside of us because he keeps his promises. He has a 100% track record on keeping promises. If he says it, if he promises it, it's going to happen. You can just go into the Old Testament and look at the promises. We call them prophecies. The promises about the Messiah who was going to come. And we see all of those fulfilled in Jesus. You can see Jesus in the Gospels make promises about his death and his resurrection. And we can see all of those come into reality through the end of the Gospels into the book of Acts. You can see all the other promises that we have in the New Testament. Many of them have come true, enough for us to say the rest of them will one day come true as well. God has a 100% track record of keeping his promises. But notice in that passage, did you notice, like, promises and hope, it's not just for us to keep for ourselves. I mean, yes, it's good to build that into our lives, but we're also meant to share it with other people. That if I see someone who is struggling in despair, who's struggling without hope, I'm meant to share it with them and remind them of who God is and what he has promised. I'm meant to stir others up, and I would hope that there would be people that would do that for me. And there are. I've got friends in my life who are there in place to do that for me. Do you have somebody like that for you? Like that if you start to spiral through whatever circumstance, whatever's going on in your life, or maybe whatever news you're hearing, somebody will step in and remind you, like, no, this is just a moment in a much bigger story. Let me remind you who God is. You have somebody like that? If you don't, you should. That's how we're designed to be in that kind of community that pulls us along. Here's another thing that I see the promises of God building in my life, but it builds patience. It builds patience. We're not a very patient culture anymore. We get things very instantly. You've probably heard this phrase of those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Right? The core of that is really what that's saying is that we're a people who we often look just at the moment and we think this is what everything is about. And we forget about that larger story. And we get very impatient because we don't see all these promises. We don't see the things of God in the scriptures maybe coming to life as fast as we want them to come to life. But the reality is God operates very differently than we do, especially when it comes to time. We mentioned this verse last week and kind of looked at the repentance side, but I think it's worth bringing this verse back to look at a different angle. This is from 2 Peter 3 that Dave shared last week. It says this: "But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient towards you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance." So Peter is actually writing this in response to that persecution that the church is experiencing. There are people who are mocking these followers of Jesus, saying, well, where are these promises? Why aren't they coming true? Look at you guys, you're fools for anchoring your life into these things, and yet your lives are falling apart from the outside, right? They're anchoring themselves into this deeper thing, but everybody's looking at them and they're saying, you're a bunch of fools. Why would you do this? Why would you anchor yourself into this? And Peter reminds them that God will fulfill his promises, but he does it in his timing. See, what Peter's reminding them of is that God doesn't operate like we operate. I mean, yes, he is intimately involved in all of the details of our lives and what's going on here in our reality, but we have to remember that God exists outside of our reality. He exists in a reality that's completely his own. He has created this reality for us. In fact, the way that we look at time is measured by the sun, the moon, the stars, the things that he gave us, the things that he created for us to even measure time by. He's not constrained by that. And so what we can't do is just project that onto God and say, God, you're not doing things in the timing that I would want you to do them in, therefore your promises are not true. Your word is not true. No, what Peter reminds us of here is that God operates in a different time because he can see the entire story from front to back. He's not stuck in the moment like we can get stuck in the moment. He can see how the whole thing is operating. Here's another thing that we can see that the promises of God will build into our lives, is that it builds steadfastness. Now, steadfastness, it's not like a word that we use often, right, in regular vocabulary, but I like this one because one of the promises that I see in the scriptures that I love the most is the most repeated promise and the most repeated idea about God in the scriptures is his steadfast love for us. So I like this word because it reminds me of something that is just driven down in the ground and it cannot be moved. It's steadfast. It's something that you can anchor your life to. I like it because it gives me that mental image, and not in the same like superstitious way as the Persian king and things rubbing off, but in some ways, the closer we get to God, the more we trust in him, some of that steadfastness, it begins to rub off on us. That when the difficulties, when the uncertainties of life come our way, we're more stable, we're more sturdy, not because we're the ones who are necessarily steadfast, but we're anchored into the one who is. Listen how James, this is Jesus' little brother. Listen how James talks about this in his letter in the New Testament. He says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." He's saying that steadfastness in the struggle and the trials, it's making this bigger, more beautiful picture than you could ever imagine. So stick with it. It's developing something inside of you, something that is complete. So you see what these things can build into our lives, these promises of God, that when we get into the scriptures and we read through his promises, we can see how it develops hope inside of us and patience inside of us, steadfastness inside of us. It builds these things into our life so that when the storms of life come, we're not shaken by them. When the uncertainty comes, we're not shaken. That's what hope and patience and steadfast could do. That's just three that this week I was thinking through. These are what God has built into my life through his promises. But I learned this important lesson along the way, that I learned that God's promises, they had to become real to me, and they only became real to me when they became a part of me. When they became a part of who I was. I had to put these things into practice. I couldn't just have the treehouse laying in the driveway. I had to put it together. I had to start putting these things into action. I had to build them into my life. One trusting moment with God at a time. Some assembly was required. So here's what I did. I put together just like 10 promises I could think of this week that I thought these are some really good ones that I return to very often in my own life to remind me of what is true and what God has promised in my life whenever someone or something or some circumstance tries to tell me otherwise, that I'm unloved, that I'm unheard, whatever it may be. I return to these very often. And so I had our creative team design something. It's on our app. You can go onto the resource tab of our app and you can download this, 10 promises from God with the scriptures right on there. Super easy read. So maybe you kind of swap out whatever you're reading this week and you dig into these a little bit. See how these can build some truth to your reality this week, build some hope and some patience and some steadfastness in your life. So check out that resource that I put together on the app. I'd love for you guys to be able to check that out. Put them into practice. That's the big idea. We can't just have the words of God. We can't just have the promises of God on our shelf somewhere, or maybe even framed in our offices or in our home somewhere. It's not about just knowing them. It's about putting them into practice, about trusting him, about actually building our lives on them. That's what we do when we're in the moment and we can't see the whole story. I want you to hear the words of Jesus. He says this in Matthew 7. He says, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them, does not put them into practice, does not build their life on them, will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. You know, one thing I love about reading the words of Jesus is that he never sugarcoats life for us. He tells us no matter where you build your house, no matter where you build your life, storms are coming. The wind is coming. The rain is coming. And there's only one thing that you can build your life on that will help you survive it. That's him. To build your life on the foundation of Jesus Christ and his promised words, his promise of salvation, his promise of love, his promise of grace, his promise that when we pray to him, he hears us. His promise that if we desire justice, even though we may not see it right now, he is a God of justice and one day we will. There are so many promises saturated throughout the scriptures, and he says, you need to build your life on these, or else when the uncertain times come, everything will fall apart. You want to know, listen how silly this is. You know how I chose a college to go to? I chased after a girl. I did. I had been dating her for a few years. I graduated from high school and I went to a local college for a few semesters. She was a year behind me. And when she graduated, she decided to go to a different college. And so I did the natural thing that any sane person would do. I left my scholarship behind. I left my friends behind, left my family behind. I moved 5 hours away so that I could be with her. We'd been dating for a while and I was starting to really think like, man, she is the one. The problem was she didn't think that about me. And then like this big blow to my ego, my soul, everything, she just called me up one day after a few years of being there. She called me up one day. She said, I'm quitting college. I'm quitting my job. And I'm quitting you. And she moved back home. Wrecked my soul, wrecked my life. I was so heartbroken in this moment because who could dump me, right? I mean, come on. But she did. And it wrecked me. It was a hard moment for me. And I wasn't following Jesus at the time. But I'll tell you, I went through this cycle of prayers. And the prayers were at first begging God and pleading with God to fix this, to bring her back, to help us to heal whatever is going on. And then the next day it would be me being really mad at God for whatever is going on. And then the next day it would be me bargaining with God. God, please, if you'll do this, then I will do whatever you want. And then the next day would be me being mad at him again. And it was this cycle over and over and over again of me praying and hearing nothing from God. And I was so stuck in the moment, so stuck in the pain of that moment. But I'll tell you what, now that I'm standing on this side decades later, I am so glad that he shut that door in my face. So glad. I'm so thankful for all the no's that he has given my prayers. I'm so thankful for all the not yets that he has given to me. I'm so thankful for all the moments where he said, I'm not going to let you settle because I've got something greater for you down the line. I've learned to kind of sit in these moments that are really difficult and say, okay, God, I'm going to trust you because I can't see the whole picture. You can see the whole picture. I can't see you, or I can't see the whole picture in that moment. And I could go on and on and on and tell you what that shut door meant for me, but I'll give you long story short. Because of that shut door, because she left, I found myself free on a Thursday night. I had a friend who kept inviting me to this gathering with him and his buddies for months on end, and just to shut him up. I went to this Thursday evening gathering. It was hosted by a group called Campus Crusade for Christ. And I walked in that room and I immediately thought, Christians are weird. And I'm going to tell you, you're still weird, okay? Like, there's something weird about it. But I went to this meeting and I heard that they were going to do this thing over Christmas. They were going to go to a conference down in Charlotte. I thought that might sound fun. So I don't recommend this. I got in a car with a bunch of strangers and left for 2 weeks to go to Charlotte, to go to this conference. First night of the conference, this man stood up on stage. He began talking about how the difficulties of life make such an impact on us and our decision making. And I'm telling you what, that guy spoke to me. First time I ever heard the gospel in my life. And I said yes to Jesus, all because I had a random Thursday night free that I didn't have free before because I was spending it with my girlfriend. And I met Jesus that night. And the amazing part of that story is later that night I also met my wife. Yeah, so we've been married for 23 years. In the moment, I didn't want that to happen. But now that I'm on this side, I am so glad that God shut that door in my face. I'm so glad that I had all that uncertainty that brought me to him and brought me to this future and really brought me to where I'm standing right now, talking to you. See, that's what these promises build into us. They build this ability to just trust him even when we can't understand it all. And when we look in this story, when we look at Esther and Mordecai and Haman and the king, they don't realize that they're in this grand story of what's happening. But we start to see them trust in these little moments. We see Mordecai early on. He trusts that God is going to deliver them somehow. He's getting a little peek into that reality that God lives in through a promise that he remembered all those years ago, given to a guy named Abraham. That's the same thing that you and I have. We've got these promises in his word. They're little glimpses into the reality of God that allow us to build our lives onto something greater. And we never know what that pivotal moment might be. It was a sleepless night for the king. It was a random Thursday for me. We never know what those moments are going to be, but we know the one who's controlling it all. And if we're willing to build our lives on Jesus Christ and his promises, then you can get through anything. You can get through any uncertainty that this world will try to throw at you. I promise you that. You can do that. You can get through any difficulty that Satan wants to throw at you, that work wants to throw at you, that your relationships want to throw at you, that your kids want to throw at you. You can get through anything by building your life on the promises of God. Let me pray for us. Father, I thank you for your promises that are deeply ingrained into your word, to think that there are thousands of them right at our fingertips, access to who you are and the reality in which you operate. We're thankful that you remind us that if we're feeling lonely, you promise that you are with us and you will never forsake us. If we're feeling unloved, you promise that there is nothing that can separate us from your love. If we just feel shaken, we're reminded that you know more details about us than we know about ourselves, that you intimately know us and intimately care for us, that no matter what we're going through, it's not that you are silent, it's not that you have abandoned us, but you're orchestrating something beautiful. So help us to live in that reality. Help us to walk through this life just trusting in your promises, knowing that one day we will be able to stand on the other side of all of history and look back and say, yes, God, thank you for the no's. Thank you for the not yets. Thank you for all the sleepless nights. Thank you for all the pain, because some of the greatest things in our lives have come on the backside of pain. Father, thank you for who you are. We pray all this in the name of Jesus. Amen.